In the sweltering heat of June 1899, a neighbor's visit to the Yates farm in eastern Texas uncovered a chilling scene that would haunt Cedar Creek for generations. Inside the home, 5 young children lay lifeless in their beds, victims of a mother's unimaginable actions. Margaret Yates, once admired as the ideal frontier wife, had methodically ended her children's lives before attempting to take her own. This wasn't the work of a monster, but the tragic result of slow, unnoticed psychological collapse. For months, whispers about Margaret's struggles filled the air, dismissed as mere maternal fatigue. What drove her to such madness? The answer lies in the suffocating isolation and harsh expectations of frontier life, where her cries for help went unheard. The Yates family's story is a chilling reminder of the emotional toll of such a life, compounded by a community's failure to notice the signs. Cedar Creek, a small farming town of about 300 people, was a place where everyone knew everyone's business. Thomas Yates, a sturdy German immigrant, had arrived 5 years earlier with nothing but determination, claiming 160 acres under the Homestead Act. Over the years, he had built a prosperous farm, but to truly succeed, he needed a wife to help manage the household and bear children. Margaret Owen, a refined woman from Austin, was chosen, despite being considered too old for marriage at 19 by frontier standards. Her beauty and gentleness made her a perfect match for Thomas. Please give me a like and subscribe so I can be motivated to create more great videos. Their marriage in 1892 marked the beginning of what seemed to be a fairy tale life. Margaret adapted to frontier life, with Grace becoming a skilled homemaker and loving mother to their children, William, Sarah the twins, James and Mary, and Samuel. Their home was admired by neighbors for its cleanliness and well-behaved children. Yet as the years passed, Margaret's bright demeanor began to fade. She grew quieter and more withdrawn, her once bright smile now forced. Margaret's isolation deepened. With Thomas frequently away, she was left alone with 5 young children on a remote farm. The harsh winter of 1897 and a summer drought compounded her struggles, leaving the family in financial trouble. During one such lonely period, neighbor Helen Morrison visited and found Margaret in a state of neglect. Her home was a mess, and Margaret's behavior was unsettling. She seemed disoriented and resentful toward her children, especially baby Samuel. Despite Helen's concerns, Thomas dismissed the issue, attributing Margaret's behavior to emotional weakness and urging her to adapt to frontier life. As the months went on, more signs of Margaret's deteriorating mental state became apparent. Neighbors noticed her confusion and increasing emotional distress. The children, too, began to show signs of neglect. William went to neighbors asking for food. Sarah became withdrawn, and the twins hid when voices were raised. Even Margaret's visit to the local doctor revealed nothing physically wrong, though he noted her nervousness and attributed it to hysteria, a common diagnosis for women of her age. The signs were there, but no one could have foreseen the horrific events that would soon unfold on the Yates farm. Margaret's prescribed treatment was rest, fresh air, and laudanum to calm her nerves. Initially, the medicine seemed to help stabilizing her mood and allowing her to manage her household duties. But soon Margaret became dependent on larger doses to maintain the calming effect. Thomas, seeing his wife more manageable, did not question her growing reliance on the drug. By spring 1898, her condition had worsened, but she had become adept at hiding it, masking her struggles during church services and social gatherings. However, signs of neglect were evident. Mismatched clothes, simple meals, a house in disarray, and a garden overtaken by weeds. Her patience with the children, once abundant, now turned to frustration, and she began to view them as burdens. The older children stepped in to care for baby Samuel, but Thomas, preoccupied with the farm's challenges, remained unaware. When neighbors raised concerns, he dismissed them, unwilling to acknowledge his family's troubles. His pride in maintaining a perfect household kept him from accepting any signs of failure. By summer 1898, Margaret's isolation deepened. She stopped attending church declined invitations, and even spoke to neighbors through closed doors. Those who saw her were shocked by her physical decline. She had lost weight, her hair was unkempt, and her eyes had become lifeless. Her voice grew monotonous, and she often seemed to speak to people no one else could hear. The birth of Samuel in late 1898 was a tipping point. Complications during childbirth left Margaret weak, unable to care for the baby. The older children tried to manage, but were too young. When neighbors offered help, Margaret refused with violent determination. Her erratic behavior became the subject of gossip, but no one intervened. In 1898, there were no social services, and mental illness was largely misunderstood. As winter arrived, the Yates family became more isolated, with heavy snow trapping them on their farm. Thomas's frustrations grew as the family's financial strain worsened, and Margaret's behavior grew more alarming. She began talking to invisible companions, claiming she was praying, though her words were nonsensical. The children grew increasingly fearful of their mother's erratic behavior. Some days Margaret would play with them, telling stories, her old nurturing self briefly returning. Other days, she would lock herself in her room, leaving them to fend for themselves as she wept or raged behind closed doors. 6-year-old William later confided to neighbors that his mother had started waking them in the middle of the night, insisting they prepare for a journey. When asked where they were going, she became agitated and refused to explain, forcing them to sit quietly as she paced and muttered under her breath. Sarah began wetting herself when Margaret approached, as though her child's instincts recognized danger. The twins, barely 3 years old, began showing signs of anxiety, rocking back and forth, pulling their hair, and refusing to eat unless coaxed by their older siblings. Most troubling of all was Margaret's relationship with baby Samuel. She would stare at him for hours, her expression one of intense concentration, and when he cried, instead of comforting him, she would sometimes join in creating a cacophony of misery. Dr. Crawford, during his monthly visit in March 1899, finally acknowledged that Margaret's condition had gone beyond simple hysteria. He found her sitting motionless in the kitchen, baby Samuel crying in her lap as she stared ahead without blinking. When he spoke to her, it took several attempts to get her attention. When she finally responded, her words were strange. "They whisper at night," she said. "The children whisper and tell me things, terrible things about what's coming. The burden is too heavy." Dr. Crawford increased her medication and suggested that Thomas send her to relatives in Austin for recovery. But with the threat of spring flooding ruining his crops, Thomas refused, dismissing the idea as impractical. "She'll snap out of it," he insisted. "She just needs to toughen up." Margaret's condition only worsened. The isolation, neglect of the children, and increasingly bizarre behavior built a sense of impending disaster among the community. In May 1899, Margaret made a final desperate attempt to communicate her distress. She appeared at Mrs. Morrison's door, disheveled and frantic, carrying an ill and malnourished baby Samuel. "Helen," she whispered, "I can't do this anymore. Something terrible is going to happen, and I can't stop it. You have to take them away before it's too late." When Mrs. Morrison tried to understand, Margaret began backing away, frantically shaking her head. "It's too late. The burden is mine. I have to finish what was started. I have to free them from what's coming." These were the last coherent words Margaret spoke before walking back to her house, baby Samuel crying weakly in her arms. Mrs. Morrison, filled with dread, stood at her door debating whether to intervene. But frontier etiquette discouraged interference in family matters unless there was clear danger, and Margaret's words could have been dismissed as the ramblings of a weary mother. This decision would haunt Mrs. Morrison, as within 3 weeks, Margaret would act on her dark compulsion, and 5 innocent children would pay the ultimate price for the community's failure to heed the desperate warnings of a woman spiraling into madness. The horror in the Yates household reached its breaking point in June 1899. If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping tales. Let's uncover what happened in those final terrible days when Margaret Yates made the unthinkable decision that would forever shock her community. The heat wave that hit eastern Texas in June 1899 was unbearable, with temperatures topping 100 degrees even after sunset. The Yates farmhouse, with its small windows and thick wooden walls, became stifling, especially with 5 young children inside. Thomas left for a 3-day trip to Houston on June 18th, hoping to get a better price for his wheat crop to avoid foreclosure. His trip was their last hope. He kissed Margaret goodbye, noting that she seemed unusually calm, but blamed it on the oppressive heat. He instructed her to keep the children inside during the hottest part of the day and to conserve water. As he left, he saw them standing together in the doorway, Margaret holding baby Samuel surrounded by the other 4 children. It was the last peaceful image he would have of his family. The first day after Thomas's departure passed quietly. Mrs. Morrison, still uneasy after Margaret's strange visit, watched the house from her kitchen window. She saw the children playing in the yard, their voices carrying across the fields. Everything seemed normal, perhaps even more peaceful than usual. But inside the house, Margaret was battling a growing madness. The voices in her mind, once whispers, had become loud and clear, telling her horrifying things about her children. The laudanum that had once calmed her now seemed to make the voices stronger. What once offered her relief now opened floodgates in her mind. By the morning of June 19th, the house seemed unusually quiet. Mrs. Morrison noticed there were no children's voices or smoke coming from the chimney. Concerned, she decided to visit, bringing a basket of eggs as an excuse. When she knocked on the door, there was a long delay before Margaret finally appeared. In just 3 days, she had aged years. Her hair was loose and unwashed, her dress stained and rumpled, and her eyes had a wild, frightened look. "Margaret, dear, I brought some eggs," Mrs. Morrison said, trying to remain calm. "How are you managing with Thomas away?" Managing, Margaret repeated the word as if it were foreign to her. "Oh yes, managing. We're managing very well. The children they're being very good, very quiet." They understand now about being quiet. Mrs. Morrison tried to look inside, but the house was dark, with all the curtains drawn, despite the bright morning sun. "Are the children feeling well?" she asked. "They're resting," Margaret replied quickly. "The heat, you know. It's important they rest during the heat. Thomas said to keep them inside, and I always do what Thomas says. I'm a good wife. I've always been a good wife." Margaret's responses were strange, answering questions that hadn't been asked and ignoring those that had. Most unsettling of all was the eerie silence from inside the house. No children's voices, no footsteps, no crying from baby Samuel, who had been fussy lately. "Margaret, I'd like to see the children, just to make sure they're all right," Mrs. Morrison said, stepping closer. Margaret's reaction was immediate and intense. Her face twisted with fear and anger, and she gripped the door frame so tightly her knuckles turned white. "No," she snapped. "You can't see them. They're sleeping and they mustn't be disturbed. They need their rest. They need to be ready." "Ready for what, Margaret?" Mrs. Morrison asked, but Margaret was already shutting the door, shaking her head. "You can't understand. No one can understand what it's like, the burden, the responsibility. But I know what has to be done. I know how to protect them." The door slammed shut, leaving Mrs. Morrison standing on the porch with a growing sense of dread. She called Margaret's name, but there was no answer. After a few minutes of hesitation, she walked around the house, trying to peer through the curtained windows, but could see nothing in the dark interior. That evening, she shared her concerns with her husband Robert, who dismissed them. "Margaret's always been a bit high-strung," he said. "And it's natural she'd be nervous with Thomas away. We can't go breaking down doors just because a woman seems upset." But Helen couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She spent a restless night frequently glancing at the Yates house from her bedroom window. It remained dark and silent with no signs of the usual activity. On the morning of June 20th, 1899, the sun rose like a watchful eye over the Texas plains, bringing another brutal day of heat. Mrs. Morrison, unable to sleep, looked out toward the Yates house. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw thin wisps of smoke rising from the kitchen chimney. Finally, a sign of activity after more than a day of eerie silence. Relieved that Margaret seemed to be functioning again, Helen decided to wait before checking on her neighbor, busying herself with chores while periodically glancing across the fields. However, as the hours passed, her relief gave way to worry. The smoke from the chimney had only lasted a short time, and once again the house fell into an unnatural silence. By 10:00 a.m., with the Texas sun already beating down mercilessly, Mrs. Morrison's anxiety reached a breaking point. She convinced her husband Robert to accompany her to the Yates house under the pretense of returning a borrowed sewing basket. Robert was hesitant, but agreed, sensing his wife's distress. As they approached the house, they both noticed the overwhelming silence. Normally, the yard would have been filled with the sounds of children, but now there was nothing except the buzz of insects and the rustling of wind through the wheat fields. The house itself looked neglected, with shutters hanging askew, and the porch cluttered with forgotten objects. Robert knocked firmly on the door, and after several minutes, Margaret finally appeared. She was wearing a clean white dress, her hair neatly braided and pinned. But her face was ghostly pale, and her eyes had a strange, glassy quality, as if she were in a trance. "Good morning, Margaret," Robert said carefully. "We wanted to check on you and the children. Helen's been worried about you." Margaret stared at them for a long moment, as if trying to recall who they were. When she spoke, her voice was eerily calm and formal, as though reciting lines from memory. "How kind of you to call," she said. "I'm afraid the children can't receive visitors today. They're resting peacefully." Finally resting peacefully. There was something unsettling in her tone. Robert tried to peer past her into the house, but Margaret shifted to block his view. "Margaret, are you feeling all right?" Helen asked gently. "You look very pale." "I feel relieved," Margaret said, her strange smile returning. "The burden has been lifted. I've done what needed to be done. They're safe now. All of them are safe from what was coming." Alarmed, Robert exchanged a glance with Helen. "Margaret," he said, trying to sound authoritative, "I think we should see the children. Mrs. Morrison is concerned about their welfare." Margaret's calm facade cracked slightly, and her hands began to shake. "No one can see them," she said, her voice trembling. "They're sleeping, and they mustn't be disturbed. I've worked so hard to make sure they can sleep peacefully. They were so tired, so very tired of carrying such heavy burdens." Helen felt a chill despite the oppressive heat. Something was terribly wrong. "Margaret," she asked as gently as possible, "where are the children right now?" Margaret's smile returned, but it was unlike any Helen had ever seen, serene yet terrifying. "They're upstairs in their beds, sleeping like angels. Perfect little angels who will never have to suffer again. I made sure of that. I'm a good mother, The best mothers protect their children from suffering." Robert's face went white as the full implications of Margaret's words sank in. Without asking for permission, he pushed past her into the house, calling for the children. Margaret didn't try to stop him. She simply stood in the doorway, her eerie smile still playing at her lips. The house was stifling hot and filled with a strange, sweet smell Robert couldn't identify. The downstairs rooms were neat and clean, but eerily quiet. He bounded up the narrow stairs, Helen close behind both of them, calling for William, Sarah, James, Mary, and baby Samuel. What they found in the children's bedroom would haunt them forever. All 5 children lay motionless in their beds, tucked neatly in with clean sheets pulled up to their chins. They looked peaceful, as though merely taking a nap, but their skin had a waxy, unnatural pallor. They were completely still. Robert approached William's bed first, his hands trembling as he touched the boy's cold, rigid skin. There was no doubt the child had been dead for hours, perhaps since the day before. A quick check of the other children confirmed the horrifying truth. All 5 Yates children were dead. Helen's scream of disbelief and horror shattered the silence echoing through the house and across the fields. The raw, primal sounds seemed to tear apart the peaceful morning. Robert stood frozen, unable to comprehend what they had discovered. Downstairs, Margaret had closed the front door and sat calmly in her rocking chair, humming a lullaby as though nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. When the Morrisons rushed downstairs, Robert shouting questions and demands for answers, Margaret looked up at them with genuine surprise. "You woke them up?" she said, her tone sad. "I worked so hard to make sure they could sleep peacefully, and you woke them up? Now they'll be frightened again." It was then that Robert noticed the empty bottle on the kitchen table, the laudanum Dr. Crawford had prescribed for Margaret's nerves. Next to it was a smaller bottle that had once contained paregoric, a medicine commonly used to treat children's stomach ailments. Both bottles were empty. The terrible truth became undeniable. Margaret had given her children fatal doses of the opium-based medicines, likely mixed into their food or drink to mask the bitter taste. She had then carefully tucked them into their beds, waiting for the drugs to take effect, believing in her twisted mind that she was protecting them from some unnamed horror. Robert bolted from the house to summon help, leaving his wife to keep watch over Margaret, who remained completely detached from reality. Helen sat in the kitchen, tears streaming down her face, while Margaret continued to rock and hum occasionally, commenting on how peaceful the children looked and how relieved she was that they were finally safe. When the sheriff arrived an hour later, followed by Dr. Crawford and several men from town, Margaret greeted them politely, offering to make coffee as if they were guests. She showed no resistance when they went upstairs to examine the children. When they returned with grave faces to confirm what everyone had feared, she nodded as though their conclusion was exactly what she expected. "It was the only way," she told them matter-of-factly. They were going to suffer so much. The voices told me what was coming, the terrible things that would happen to them if I didn't act. A good mother protects her children from suffering, even if it means making the hardest sacrifice of all. Dr. Crawford confirmed that the children had died from opium poisoning, likely administered the previous evening. The peaceful expressions on their faces suggested they had simply fallen asleep and never woken up unaware of their mother's actions. Thomas Yates returned from Houston that evening, unaware that his world had been destroyed in his absence. The sheriff met him at the edge of town to break the news, but nothing could prepare him for the sight of his 5 children lying motionless in their beds, or for the sight of his wife sitting calmly in the parlor, asking how his business trip had gone, as if nothing had happened. The man who had left 3 days earlier as a struggling farmer returned to find himself the sole survivor of a family that had been systematically destroyed by the very person he had trusted to protect it. Thomas collapsed beside William's bed, his anguished cries echoing through the house as the full weight of his loss crashed down upon him. Margaret watched her husband's breakdown with a detached curiosity, occasionally offering comfort in a tone that was more fitting for a child with a scraped knee. "Don't cry, Thomas," she said gently. "They're safe now. I made sure they're safe from all the terrible things that were coming. Isn't that what a good mother should do?" When Dr. Crawford attempted to question Margaret about her actions, her responses revealed the depth of her psychological collapse. She spoke calmly about the voices that had told her for months that her children were in danger, describing horrific scenarios of suffering that would befall them if she didn't intervene. "They told me William would grow up to be a violent man, that he would hurt people." She explained, her tone as matter-of-fact as if discussing the weather. "And little Sarah, they said terrible things would happen to her, things no mother could bear to imagine. The twins would suffer from hunger and cold. And baby Samuel, oh, the things they said about baby Samuel were the worst of all." The voices she described seemed to reflect her own fears about frontier life, magnified to unbearable extremes. Every real danger that frontier children faced, disease, violence, poverty, Early death was amplified in her disturbed mind into certainties that could only be prevented by the most drastic measures. Dr. Crawford's examination revealed that Margaret had been planning the killings for at least a week. She had hoarded laudanum and paregoric from multiple sources, telling different people that she needed the medicines for various ailments. She had also spent considerable time preparing the children's final meal, a special supper she described as a celebration complete with cookies and milk laced with enough opium to ensure their peaceful deaths. The investigation uncovered even more chilling details about Margaret's final days. She had written several letters to relatives in Austin, but none had been sent. In these letters, she described her growing conviction that unspeakable horrors awaited her children, and her determination to deliver them to God's protection before these tragedies could strike. One letter to her mother was particularly chilling, as Margaret matter-of-factly described her intentions. "Dearest Mother, by the time you receive this letter, I will have completed the most difficult task any mother has ever been called upon to perform. Do not mourn for the children, for they are beyond the reach of suffering now. I have given them the greatest gift any mother can give, eternal peace and safety in the arms of the Lord." The community's reaction to the tragedy was complex and unsettling. While everyone expressed horror at the deaths of 5 innocent children, there was also an undercurrent of relief that the problem of Margaret's troubling behavior had been resolved even in such a horrific way. Several people admitted privately that they had known something was terribly wrong, but felt powerless to intervene considering it a private family matter. Mrs. Morrison, tormented by guilt over her failure to act on her suspicions, was questioned by authorities about Margaret's behavior in the weeks leading up to the murders. Her detailed accounts revealed a pattern of warning signs that, in retrospect, seemed to point directly to the impending tragedy. "Boy, Chanu." She kept talking about protecting the children. Helen told the sheriff through her tears. "But I thought she meant protecting them from normal dangers, wild animals, accidents, illness. I never imagined she meant protecting them from life itself." The legal proceedings that followed were swift and conclusive. Margaret was declared mentally incompetent to stand trial and was committed to the state lunatic asylum in Austin, where she would spend the rest of her life. She never expressed remorse for her actions, maintaining until her death 15 years later that she had done the right thing and that her children were better off dead than facing the horrors life would have brought them. Thomas Yates sold the farm and left Cedar Creek immediately after the funerals, unable to bear living in the place where his family had been destroyed. He was never seen in the area again, though rumors persisted for years that he had changed his name and started a new life somewhere in the Western Territories, trying to escape the memories of that terrible summer. The Yates house stood empty for several years before being torn down by the county. Local residents claimed it was haunted, reporting strange sounds and lights in the windows during the long Texas nights. Whether these phenomena were real or simply the product of guilty consciences and traumatized memories, no one was brave enough to investigate. The Yates family tragedy raised uncomfortable questions about frontier life that the community of Cedar Creek was reluctant to address. How many other women were struggling with similar psychological pressures in isolation, with no support system and no understanding of mental illness? How many warning signs were being ignored or misinterpreted throughout the scattered farming communities of the American frontier? Dr. Crawford, deeply affected by his failure to recognize the severity of Margaret's condition, began studying what little was known about mental illness in women. He discovered that cases similar to Margaret's were more common than anyone wanted to admit, particularly in isolated frontier communities where women were expected to manage impossible burdens with no help or understanding. In his private papers discovered after his death, Dr. Crawford wrote extensively about the Yates case and its implications. "We have created a society that places impossible demands on women, particularly mothers, and then acts surprised when some of them break under the pressure. Margaret Yates was not born a killer. She was created by circumstances that would have challenged the sanity of any human being. The tragedy also highlighted the dangerous lack of understanding about mental illness in the 19th century. Margaret's obvious symptoms of severe depression and psychosis had been dismissed as female hysteria or nervous exhaustion. Conditions treated with ineffective remedies and moral judgments rather than genuine medical intervention. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that the community had failed these children not through malice, but through willful blindness. The signs of Margaret's deteriorating mental state had been visible to many, but the social norms of the time made it nearly impossible for anyone to take effective action. The story of the Yates family murders became a cautionary tale whispered about in farming communities throughout Texas for generations. Parents used it to teach their children about the importance of looking out for neighbors, and communities began to develop informal support systems for isolated families. However, the deeper lessons of the tragedy about the crushing pressures placed on frontier women, the dangers of untreated mental illness, and the responsibility of communities to protect their most vulnerable members were largely ignored. It would be many decades before American society began to understand the complex factors that could drive a loving mother to commit such an unthinkable act. The 5 Yates children were buried in the Cedar Creek Cemetery in a small plot that Thomas purchased before leaving town forever. Their headstones bear simple inscriptions with their names and dates of birth and death, but nothing hints at the terrible circumstances of their passing. Over the years, the graves have become a place of pilgrimage for those fascinated by the darker aspects of frontier history. Though most visitors leave more disturbed than satisfied by their encounter with this tangible reminder of tragedy, local historians have documented other similar cases from the same era where women committed violence against their families under comparable circumstances. These cases suggest that the Yates tragedy was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of psychological breakdown among frontier women. While less well-documented, these stories paint a picture of an epidemic of mental illness that was ignored, misunderstood, and ultimately fatal for many families. Medical journals of the time contain references to prairie madness or frontier fever, terms used to describe psychological breakdowns affecting women living in isolation. However, these conditions were often dismissed as moral weakness or female fragility, rather than recognized as legitimate mental health crises requiring proper treatment. Margaret Yates spent her remaining years in the Austin Asylum, where she was described as a model patient who caused no trouble and seemed to live in a world entirely separate from reality. She never spoke about her children or acknowledged what she had done to them. Instead, she spent her days preparing imaginary meals for 5 children, setting places at tables that existed only in her mind, and having animated conversations with invisible companions she believed were her sons and daughters. She continued to live in the delusion that she had saved her children from suffering, convinced that they were living happily in some alternate reality, where the dangers of frontier life could not touch them. The Yates family murders stand as one of the darkest chapters in American frontier history, a stark reminder that the romanticized vision of pioneering life often concealed brutal realities that destroyed families and shattered communities. The story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the price of westward expansion, particularly the costs paid by women and children who were expected to endure unimaginable hardships with grace and silence. Margaret Yates was not a monster, despite the monstrous nature of her final acts. She was a woman failed by every system that should have protected her and her children, medical, social, and familial. Her tragedy illuminates the dangerous gaps in understanding and support that marked frontier society, gaps that proved fatal for 5 innocent children who deserved better from the adults entrusted with their care. The fact that warning signs had been visible for months before the murders makes the tragedy even more heartbreaking. In a different time and place, with better understanding of mental illness and stronger community support systems, Margaret Yates might have received the help she desperately needed. Her children might have grown up to live full lives, contributing to the building of the American West, rather than becoming victims of its harshest realities. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Yates story is how easily it could have been prevented, and how many similar tragedies might have occurred in isolated farmsteads and frontier settlements where families struggled alone against overwhelming odds. The silence of the Texas plains holds many secrets, and not all of them are as well documented as the fate of the Yates family. This mystery shows us the deadly consequences of isolation, untreated mental illness, and society's failure to protect its most vulnerable members. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there darker secrets still buried in the Texas soil? The frontier was a place where people could disappear without a trace, where families could be destroyed without anyone noticing until it was too late. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think there were other cases like this that were never discovered? How many other Margaret Yates were out there struggling in silence until they reached their breaking point? If you found this tale as haunting as we did, subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from America's darkest chapters. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our investigations into the mysteries others dare not explore. Share this video with someone brave enough to confront these uncomfortable truths about our nation's past. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones created by the very society that claims to protect us. See you in the next dark corner of American history. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.